reduction of government spending multiplier for the interaction of financial and goods markets. There's going to be a reduction in the effect of monetary policy for the interaction of the goods market. Right? Well, so when the central bank increases the money supply, right, this would lead to a drop in interest rates, with everything else, particularly y being constant, down here. Point. Right? But as the interest rate starts to fall, investment becomes more and more attractive. Right? The laser pointer project becomes a project that I want to engage in. So what does that mean? Well, as the interest rate starts to fall, investment increases. Y isn't going to remain constant because investment is a component of demand. So we're going to see, as interest rates fall, investment increasing, output increasing, and we're going to have multiplier effects, or second round effects of consumption and income and the like. Right, so we'll end up then at a point A prime, where compared with the original outcome, the interest rate will not fall by as much, right? But output will increase. Right? And the fall of the interest rate is then slowed down because as it starts to fall and this investment goes up, output goes up, there's a transaction demand that goes up, right? So we end up demanding right, this increase in the money supply, right, at a higher interest rate than we otherwise would. Interest rates don't need to fall by as much. Right? So in other words, you can say this monetary policy shock is being partially accommodated by the increase in output that the lower interest rates it generates produce. All right, so we can start to put together a table here. Right. Which curves shifts when? Right. T and G, both components of the IS curve, not components of the LM curve, so it's just shifts of the IS curve. So we just have to worry about fiscal policy shifting the IS curve, and then we find the equilibrium by moving along the LM curve. Money supply shifts the LM curve. Right? So we have this financial markets and goods markets curves, and they're controlled by the two separate entities that we generally think of with policy. Right? That's kind of another way to think of to fiscal policy and monetary policy. We could think of goods market policy and money and financial market policy. Yeah? Now, the goods market policy affects financial markets, and then it indirectly, and then it shifts the interest rate and changes transaction demands, which then feeds back on the goods market in terms of investment. Monetary policy also affects the goods demand, and then its changes in money supply and nominal interest rates affect investment, right? Which is, of course, a component of the goods economy. Right, so it's nice to have this dichotomy, this orthogonalization. We've split fiscal and monetary policy into affecting one of two curves individually. Right? A lot of times policy is going to go as the coordinate policy mix. Yeah? We can think of a policy mix that might allow us to unfold the multiplier effect to its fullest extent. Or we could consolidate the government budget, the state budget, without having detrimental or too large detrimental income effects. Right? They can also work in opposite directions, right? Counteract each other too. So policy mixes can be beneficial, can work together, or they can also work against each other. So these are the first. Let's do a good exam question. Might even be in the problem set too. But so here we have the government expenditure multiplier and how it's reduced through the interaction of financial markets on the LM curve. What would monetary policy have to do in order for the government expenditure multiply to unfold completely? Does anyone have an idea?
Sorry, can you ask me?
What would monetary policy have to do in order for the government multiplier effect that we see here to unfold in the interaction with financial markets? Right, so we saw that the government expenditure multiplier didn't happen. Output didn't increase by this much, but only by this much, because interest rates went up. We moved along the LM curve instead of moving straight across. What would monetary policy have to do so we could get this entire multiplier effect?
Fix the interest rate.
Yeah, I could fix the interest rate, right? That's one possibility. Right? So we could just forget about this LM business and have a fixed interest rate. How about if they don't want to fix interest rate, but they control the money supply? What would they have to do?
Receive the LM curve
Shift the LM curve up or down?
down.
Down, right? And how about if they shift it right to that point? So that would have the same effect as holding the interest rate constant, right? Which, if they're controlling the money supply, they would increase the money supply. So now, if the central bank works together with the government expenditure proposal, we can make the entirety of this government expenditure multiplier to unfold. In other words, right, as financial markets maybe see the resources being crowded out by the government borrowing, right, the central bank can step in and increase the liquidity by exactly the amount that the government would be crowding out. So we get then the entire multiplier effect. So that would be the full unfolding of the multiplier effect. Right, we can also think of coordinated business cycle stabilization. Right, so let's say, like, think maybe 2001, and we're coming out of the dot-com, so the end of the 1990s. If you did anything involved with the internet in America, it was a good business model. There was there was overinvestment in housing. In the 2000s, the 1990s, there was overinvestment in perhaps internet-based business. So there was a drop in business conditions there, and then something else happened in 2001. We had the terrorist attack in New York, the World Trade Center, that also caused further financial market turbulence. Right, so all this combined means we have a large drop in investment demand. Capital I, went down in the United States. If government did nothing, right, we would likely see the economy fall to a point A double prime. So a large recession, a large decrease in output. But if the government responds, it means that what are some options we have? Well, if we find A drops to A double prime, we could engage in a large expansionary fiscal policy. Right? We could increase government expenditures by the entire amount of the drop in investment demand, right? And push the economy back to the point A. That would be a very large increase in G. Right? Create a lot of government debt. Right? This might be a very large increase in the deficit, right? That might be unsustainable. All right, so it's probably unlikely that the fiscal policy can really, take up all of the slack. Right? Likewise, if we fall to the point A double prime here, we could increase the money supply by dropping interest rates all the way down to here, right? Or increasing the money supply until the LM curve comes all the way down to here. So with a very large increase in the money supply. We can do probably more sensible policy, right, if we do a little bit of fiscal expansion and a little bit of monetary expansion. The two of them together, right, could make up most of the distance in output. Right, so the idea here is instead of increasing the IS curve all the way, so we go back from A prime to A double, or to A, or increasing the money supply, so we go from A double prime all the way down here, we can maybe move horizontally, with a small shift back in the IS curve, so a small increase in government expenditures, and a small increase in the money supply. Right, so policy working together can make it less expensive, right, for any one policy to have to do all the work. Right, we can look at maybe the recessions here. So in 2001 versus then the financial crisis, right? And we see after the recession in 2008, that the U.S. recovered pretty quickly and was back to growth rates of about 3% within a year or so, whereas it took Germany and the EU several more years to get back up there. Right? After the financial crisis, perhaps the recovery in Germany was quicker than the rest of Europe. There's lots of talk about the economic miracle response of Germany. For the Europe in general, there seemed to be a much elongated downturn. So the U.S. was back to its 3%, roughly stable, just a couple years after the financial crisis, whereas Germany and Europe then got stuck in another crisis, the European debt crisis. Right? Maybe policy mix in the United States was stronger. Yeah? Perhaps there was a better job of stabilizing the economy. Right? What other evidence could we see for this? Well, right, in the United States, we see fiscal policy and monetary policy were both employed together very aggressively. So we look at the interest rate of the Federal Reserve in black and the interest rate of the ECB in red. Right, what you see is at the 2001, the interest rate dropped from 6.5% to 1%. So that's a 5.5 percentage point decrease in interest rates. Whereas for the same period of time, the decrease was 2.5 percentage points by the European Central Bank. And its initial increase was much quicker than the initial decrease. Right, so the United States monetary policy seemed to move stronger and more quickly. Right? And also, you can see that in terms of the financial crisis, it took the ECB about a year later to start lowering interest rates. And then they didn't lower them as far as the United States did. So stronger, fast, aggressive monetary policy response. And then also here we have the deficits. That's what it should be. It's not a label. This is the surplus, right? So the surplus went negative, so that the U.S. engaged in the deficit much more strongly after the 2001 dot-com bust, and then also the financial crisis. the fiscal response was also much stronger in the United States. So perhaps the US came out more quickly and more strongly out of both of these recessions because we had a stronger policy mix than in Europe. Also, good examples of policy coordination. Think of with President Bill Clinton and Alan Greenspan, who was chairman of the Board of Governors. And we started at point A, and the goal was we wanted to reduce the government debt, so lower government debt by reducing the deficit, but we didn't want to cause a recession. Okay? So if we just shifted the IS inwards, if we cut G and raise T, right, we'd move along the LM curve and end up at a point B. Output would go down. But what happened is, along with this decrease in G, increase in T, so a consolidation fiscally, we had an expansionary monetary policy. Alan Greenspan lowered nominal interest rates. And by so much that the LM shifted out such that we ended up having an increase in output. So we had a deficit reduction with not only without negative effects, but actually with positive effects on income. Policy and working together. Policy working against each other, you can see in terms of the German reunification. We started at a point A here. We had a expansive fiscal policy, lots of government works, building new highways and expanding in the former East Germany. The German central bank, the Bundesbank, was very concerned about the dangers to the risks of inflation, and in response engaged in a contraction of the money supply. Right? So instead of the economy moving along the LM curve out to here with the expansion of fiscal policy, we ended up moving up here. So we had a very small, mild expansion. And so government started spending lots and lots of money, and not only wasn't there not the full multiplier effect, there wasn't even the full ISLM effect because we were counteracted by monetary policy shifting the LM curve here upwards. There was barely any positive effect on outcome. It was very large expansion of fiscal policy because we had monetary policy working against fiscal policy. So we call this a tug of war. It used to be a long time ago in the Olympics. I don't know if you have like two people playing in the row. Yeah. Right, and you can see that this is the short-term interest rate in Germany rose from 4% to 9.2% during the unification. Right, and we have the GDP growth rate went up. It was just under 4%, and it was 5%. So there was this increase, right? But considering that the investment was then growing at a rate of almost 10, right? There's just a lot of pressure being exercised by this increase in the nominal interest rate. Right, so what happens then? What happens dynamically? We want to start thinking ahead to, now we're going to look at a new Keynesian model, these models of the dynamics, right? When we look in the data at what happens if we have a 1% increase in the central bank's, here is the federal funds rate, that's the Federal Reserve, the US policy rate. When this increases, we see, right, a contraction effect, a decrease in output, decrease in employment, and decrease in sales. Right? The largest effect of this change in policy happens about a year and a half after this policy takes place. Right? So, right, and it starts to subside a couple of years later. Right? So here we see sales in general recover about 2.5 would start to recover about 2 years after this policy change. Right? So it's also kind of, imagine, you know exactly what it's like. There's a difference in traffic if you're riding a motorbike or if you're driving one of these big trucks, right? Why? With a motorbike, you can turn very, very quickly. Monetary policy is more like driving a big truck. When you turn the steering wheel, it takes your truck about a year or even a year and a half to start to make the turn, right? So this makes monetary policy very difficult, right? If you're driving, right? You turn the steering wheel, you have to steer it in advance because, it takes you a while to make that corner. All right.
So can I ask, I didn't expect it to be the opposite, negative effect of the increasing, of 1% increase in the growth rates on each of these things?
So here, so remember, so an increase in the interest rate, that makes it, more
Interest
expensive.
rate.
Interest rate, not the money, but it's interest rate.
Another
So,
one is a problem.
yeah, so 1% increase, percentage point increase in the federal funds rate, that's the interest rate. So, and then the 80s and liquidity control is what we did in many countries up until like 1983. And then also you could argue during the financial crisis and during COVID, monetary policy did a lot of liquidity control, either controlling the money supply or by controlling liquidity through direct bond purchases and other sorts of unconventional monetary policy. But outside of this period, we see interest rate control, like you're suggesting here for keeping the nominal interest rate constant to get the multiplier effect, to direct control of the interest rate. Right? And one way this is, can be written and out as a rule is actually observed by John Taylor, who is an economist in the United States at Stanford, the Hoover Institute. And it was done through an observation. He noticed that, well, wait a second, we can predict movements in the central bank interest rate by observing movements in inflation and output. And so it's first here just an empirical observation. The central bank tends to raise the nominal interest rate when inflation exceeds its target. The central bank tends to raise the interest rate when output exceeds maybe some average growth rate, some trend growth rate, or some natural slack rate of production. Right? Now, how strong this reaction is, they raise if inflation exceeds its goal. How strong this reaction is that be controlled by a parameter, H, and likewise B. Right? And we see this number, H is perhaps 0.5, and B maybe 0.5 also. Yeah, just fine in the quarterly rate. Right? And then, right, so it was done empirically, so there's going to be a regression, we have a residual, right? And this residual we can interpret then as perhaps a monetary policy shock. If we now take this as a rule, as a prescription of how monetary policy should be conducted, right? Monetary policy isn't going to perfectly follow this rule. Right? It's going to make mistakes perhaps sometimes, either because it mismeasured, right? Maybe it can't perfectly control the interest rate we're looking at. It's controlling maybe the federal funds rate, which is not the same as a market rate that we might be interested in controlling for consumer credits or whatnot. Right? And if you look back in time, so this is what John Taylor was looking at, he saw that the actual movements of the federal funds rate were matched remarkably well by this rule that he came up with. And a lot of research was then started to ask the question, well, does this hold for other countries for longer periods of time? Right? And we see then something remarkable. If we look after about 1982 for United States, Germany, United Kingdom, and Japan, a rule that's estimated for these individual countries does a very good job in explaining the nominal interest rate. The deviations of the actual policy rate from what's prescribed by this interest rate rule are very, very small. Whereas beforehand, that's not the case. Right? So basically, I'm trying to tell you my story before about monetary policy controlling the money supply before 1982, and then afterwards changing the nominal interest rate was right. That's right. That's what the data saying. What I said was right. Yeah? This is what we should see here. There's a regime switch. We seem to have a shift from liquidity control to interest rate control. And this is not just an American phenomenon. This is something we see in many countries. Yeah? Inflation targeting through interest rate control. And if we take this rule, and we're going to take for a second, I've talked a little bit about like the real interest rate. We were talking about which projects, the returns that they give us in terms of real returns, as opposed to maybe the nominal interest rate that we can earn with money. Right, if we start to take this difference for a second seriously, we're going to come back in a couple of lectures and do it more formally. Right, then our demand function is going to depend on consumption, depends on disposable income. It might also depend on some other terms that we didn't talk about. Investment depends on income, sales, positively and negatively on the real interest rate. And there's some sense that we might have some other factors, maybe sentiment, right? If you're optimistic about the future, you might buy more. Right? You know, things are going to work out just fine. I've been thinking about getting that new motorbike for a while. I'm going to go do it today. You know? Sentiment, confidence in the economy. Or, you know what? This next project, our projects are going well. I think the economy is going to continue to grow here in Vietnam. We should go ahead and build that new factor. Right? Maybe above and beyond simply measuring current sales and the current real interest rate as cost, you might also be affected by sentiment, both as an investor and as consumers. And there's some reason, some consumption might depend on the real interest rate. We could call this maybe part of a wealth effect, or so remember that story of the 500,000 dong you found on the ground? Let's compare two different cases. So one, as it is right now. So you find the 500,000 dong on the ground. You'll probably spend some of it and do something fun, do something nice, and then you'll probably save some of it maybe to do something fun this weekend or next month, or right, for the next New Year's holiday, or for whatever, right? So you're going to save some of it. Right? Now, let's do the same situation. You find this 500,000 dong on the ground, but I tell you that the real interest rate, or the interest rate, keep the nominal interest rate, is actually 100% per day. I'm going to save this and save it all, because this is going to become, this is going to generate a lot of income. So the proportion of this additional income that we choose to save is going to kind of depend on what the interest rate is. And well, wait a second, what's the proportion of this 500,000 dong that we don't save? That's the proportion that we consume. So our consumption is likely also going to depend on the real interest rate. When the real interest rate is really, really high, savings, right, is a better use of our resources. Right? It's a good time to save. Our savings, our resources generate a lot of income by saving them. Or alternatively, let's say I wanted to borrow money to buy something. Well, if the interest rate's really high, It's expensive to borrow money. So in both those cases, our consumption would tend to be lower. Okay, but we can put this all together and just call our demand function. We have these direct demand components, or domestic demand, depend consumption and investment together on output, taxes negatively, our interest rate, and other factor, maybe sentiment. And then plus government expenditures. Right, if we have the same assumption that we had before, we can get this multiplier effect, 1 over 1 minus the sum of cy plus iy, that has to be less than 1. So we do this derivative, and if we have, before we had the effect of r on I was negative, and now it seems like higher interest rates is going to reduce consumption as well. So that's likely also to be a negative effect. Right. Now what we can do, we can now take this model and write a linear approximation we're going to come back when we use linear approximations in our New Keynesian model. So it's useful maybe to start thinking about that now. The name of this brand is called Gift, right? Which in English, right, means present. That's a nice thing. Does anyone know what this means in German? It's the German word for poison.
Poison.
Poison. You don't want to give the Germans a gift. Did you just Google that, or?
Yeah.
I saw that this morning, it's like, oh man, yeah. But you mean you can't come up with a name that works for everything. It's always easy to make mistakes. Like there was a Chevrolet made a car in the 1970s that was called Nova. Which they were thinking of like a supernova, so something astronomical. In Spanish, nova means doesn't go, doesn't run. It's a bad name for a car, right? You know? All right. So let's look at y is equal to some function of x. X right, and suppose we know or can calculate a point so then we can approximate y then around y bar as in fact we could go add quadratic terms, cubic terms, and if we go all the way up to infinity, then we have a nice function. Our approximation would be perfect. Which is why I can keep the equal sign. Here, if we just have the black belt, it's approximate. Right, so this gives us why do we like this as economists? Why is this useful for us? Linear relationship. Yeah, I'm trying to make a joke here. It's actually a useful joke here because it involves a derivative. We love to take derivatives. Yeah? And so my recommendation for you, this isn't, I tell this to all my students in Frankfurt too, if you're taking an exam, not just my exam, but any of the exams, as in economics, and you don't know what to do, take a derivative. Right? Why? It's actually usually the answer, one, and even if it's not the answer, if you take the derivative correctly, you might even get partial credit. Yeah? Right? So if you're stuck, just take some derivatives. Yeah? And you'd be surprised. You know? So that's why we like this. You know? All right. And so what is this gives us then? Our linear approximation would be exact at this point. It is then a lot. Okay. Why is this? Why might this be useful? Does anyone know? Can anyone calculate in their head the square of 1.12? Well, yeah. So let's see how useful this might. We could find a point. How about, let's say y is equal to x squared, right, and let's approximate around, find a close point at x equals 1. So then y is equal to 1. Okay? So y is equal to 1 plus, what's the derivative? That's 2 times x, evaluated x equals 1, is 1 times x minus 1. Right? So y is equal to 1 plus 2 times x minus did I do that right? Yeah, so 2x minus 1 is equal to 2x minus 1. All right, so ask the question, y is equal to the question when x is equal to 1.12. I would say that y is going to be close to 2.24 minus 1, 1.24, right? All right. Now you can do a calculator, right? You know, and we can check that. This is actually so we can find some, we'll see more difficult functions like this. You can start to do in your head, right? How about what if y is equal to the natural logarithm of x. Can anyone calculate natural logarithms in their head? I can't. I know, right? What about, so what is the log of 1.5? I don't know, but I know that the log of 1 is equal to 0, right? And I know that the derivative here is 1 over x, right? So y is approximately going to be equal to log of 1, or 0, plus 1 over 1 times x minus 1, right? It's going to be x minus 1. So I'd say the log of 1.5 is going to be about 0.5. Right? Would be, right? And I could calculate that in my head, right? All right. And it used the derivative, so I'm happy as the economist. All right. Now, we can also do a log linear approximation. Right? And here we can write this as we can take our y minus y bar over y bar as the object that we're looking for. So we want to know not the exact value of y, but its percentage difference from the point that we approximated. And we can write this then as f of x bar minus y bar. This is going to be equal to 0. Plus f of x bar x minus x bar divided by y bar is equal then to x bar, y bar, x bar of now. So percentage deviation in x leads to percentage deviation in y. This is nice because this term here is elasticity. We like elasticities in economics. You've heard that term come up a bunch. Right? And it's the logarithms. We can also write this as we'll do that when we get to this, the Keynesian model. But the nice thing about this is we get then percent change in x leading to percent change in y. And this is something that's really useful. Because otherwise we have to start talking about units of measurement. So if taxes go up by how much do taxes go up by? Should they go up by 15 billion or 15 trillion gone? And what's you have to figure out the unit of account, what's the size of the economy. Also, we have this measure of sentiments. What does it mean if a sentiment goes up by 1 unit? Right? How's your day today? I'm at an 8. What does that mean? If I say that, what happens if my day goes up to a 9? My sentiment is increased by 1 unit. What does that mean to you? Does that, it's hard to give that content, right? My day has gone from an 8 to a 9 in terms of my sentiment, my happiness. It's meaningless. If I say that my day is now 10% better than my day yesterday, Okay, so it's a little bit of an improvement. If I say my day is 100% better than yesterday, wow, right? Then, right, if we have it relative to something else, if we think about everything here in terms of percentage deviations, percentage changes, they're a lot easier to interpret. Right, and you can write out a linear approximation. So now instead of just x, we have a bunch of terms here, and y shows up on both sides. We can solve for, divide through by y bar to get this percentage deviation term. Right, solve for these percentage deviations in y. Right, and then use use a log approximation and look at this as log deviations or percentage deviations either way, and get then an IS curve that's been log linearized. The whole idea is, remember, even if our IS curve, if it's curved, we can always look at a point and linearize it. Right? And so locally we can look at something that's linear. And if it's difficult or cumbersome or bothersome to have the units of measurement here, right? Sometimes it's I don't know. Sometimes things are difficult. I don't know. If something costs 1,000, is that a lot or is that a little? Well, we have to know the currency, or I don't know. A lot of times people write, you might write that, and what you really mean is 1,000 Vietnamese dong. That might be, right? Okay, that's different, right? Than 1,000, right? That's 1 million, right? That's a different. That unit becomes harder to follow. Or if it's like, I don't know, 1,000 yen, right? Does anyone have the exchange rate to Japan in the top of their head? Right? Maybe, how about if it's 1,000 pesos from Argentina? I don't know. Well, units of account can be difficult sometimes, right? So we start thinking about things just in terms of percentages, right? We can just forget that. We just have to look at how things change relative to some baseline. Have they gone up? Have prices gone up by 10% or by 2% or by 100%? Then it doesn't matter whether we're measuring it in dong, 1,000 dong, euro cents, right? That's the point. All right, now we can take this Taylor rule that we had before, combine it together with the IS curve and the Fisher relation that we'll look at again. So you see how nominal interest rates are related to real interest rates plus expected inflation. Right? And this gives us an aggregate demand curve. We'll see this aggregate demand curve also interact then with our new Keynesian model later this week. Right? We'll have the IS curve combined with Taylor rule and then a supply side. Right? Okay, and this aggregate demand curve is going to tell us, right, how inflation relates to prices. So not interest rates, but now inflation to prices. And we're going to have a demand curve, right? And the nice thing with this aggregate demand curve, like the standard demand curve, it's downward sloping, and we have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. So it works conceptually just like in the micro level, except we have inflation here, perhaps we have output, aggregate output here. And we can start looking at maybe a shock. A demand shock, what's it going to do? A demand shock would tend to, output would, a negative demand shock would reduce demand, reduce then output for a given amount of inflation. And the larger H is, what was H here? Sorry, Taylor rule. So the stronger the central bank responds to inflation, or the weaker it responds to the output gap, right, the flatter or steeper a demand, the aggregate demand curve would be. Right, okay. What did I want to do with that? Yeah, so then we can think of we want to think of there being an aggregate supply curve. This is what we're going to work on with the new Keynesian model, is specifying this more cleanly. But you've seen IS and LM, you've put them together into an AD curve. Here we put together the AD curve with the Taylor rule. We can also do this. Should I do this then? Why not? So if I have IS, LM, I, Y, I. If I now look at increasing the price level, this is going to decrease the real money supply. Causing LM to shift here. Alright, so we have Y0 Y1 I0, and we had some P0, which is that if we have it relative to an initial price, maybe P from the period before, the gross inflation, and here we have a higher price. This was P1 greater than P0. Maybe let's say it sits here. Then P1. This other And this is how we could derive what's called the aggregate demand curve from the LM curve. And now the question is simply, what's the price level, what's inflation going to be? And the idea, right, from the analysis before, when we didn't look at this effect, we were always holding prices constant. And if we have an increase in demand, we've already seen that the multiplier effect might be smaller because interest rates go up, investment goes down, there's some crowding out there. But now on top of that decrease, there might also be the effect that as well as people start to demand more goods, prices might start to go up. Not all prices, not all for all goods all the time, right? But if enough of us all start wanting to buy something and they'll start doing it, some of those prices are going to go up, right? If we all go to the market at the same time and all are trying to buy the same thing, that price is going to go up. And what does that mean? Well, we're not all going to be able to buy the same amount that we would have with the old price. We've made some things more expensive, so there are fewer goods that we can afford. Right, and so now we see this output increase. Remember, that was already decreased by the interest rate going up. The multiplier is now decreased potentially even more by prices going up. And there's also a sense that as prices start to go up, we're likely to see supply adjust, right? Prices turn out to be perhaps higher than they were expecting. So other people start to raise their prices, right? We might start to see aggregate supply adjust maybe all the way to some long-term level of output. Right? And the goal of the larger models that we're going to look at is to get an ISLM perspective, or this IS Taylor rule perspective, together with the dynamics and prices, so we can talk about how quickly this movement is. Do we have the economy just shoot up if we have a demand shock? Does it just increase inflation without changing output? Do we have a very long period with an output increase, right? Or is it maybe smaller and very short? What are the exact dynamics? How far and how long does that go out? Right? That's important. You know why that's important? We need to know the exact, we need to know numbers. Right? If I get a telephone call, it's Christina Lagarde, president of the ECB. Yes, Christina, raise interest rates. She needs to know by how much. Oh, we actually have to come up with a number when we make policy decisions. It's not enough to say fiscal policy should be contractionary, monetary policy should be expansionary. Policymakers actually have to come up with a number and also plan when and for how long. All right? So how much, when, and for how long is going to depend, right, a lot on these dynamics and a lot of these specifics. Right? So we can get the basic intuition for what's going on in a lot of these macroeconomic models with ISLM like we've been looking at today, like you've seen before, right? So that's like just, if you have that in the back of your mind, you have a good feel for what's going on in the macroeconomy. Yeah? So that's why it's important, and this review that we've done today is very important. And what we're going to add on top of that is a way to understand, and a way to predict, and a way to give numbers to these movements. Right? guess, does it have? Let's define y. Let's define it as a log of y. This means we can rewrite our equation y of f of capital X as e of lowercase y equals f of e of lowercase x. No? And we take an approximation, right? E of y is approximately equal to e of y bar plus, and right, I told you economists love derivatives, and there's something really cool about this function, because we like derivatives, but we're not mathematicians, we're lazy. Okay? What's the derivative of ey with respect to y? Ey. Oh, I love it. Yeah? That's e. It's the function, the only function that's its own derivative. Yeah? How cool is that? So e y bar times y times y bar. Plus f prime x bar times integral of e of x bar x minus x bar. So this, remember, is y. So this is y bar. Y bar. This is also y bar. So we can cancel those two terms out. Right? This is x bar. And this is prime of x bar. And let's get you exactly back to exactly where I was before. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do shoot. Didn't help. I wanted to do. What do I want to do? I want to do this one. We take I think I'm tired. I'm just running around in circles, and we'll look at that when we get to it. I want to show you the log part in there, but I don't want to waste your time. Okay. So in the closed economy, right, demand for goods is the sum of consumption, investment, and government expenditure. Open economy, we add in net exports. Right, and the fiscal authority can affect aggregate demand. Right, under some assumptions, this is a very large effect. That's this government expenditure multiplier with its full unfolded, its full manifestation. If, however, we have maybe automatic stabilizers of taxes, if we have monetary policy that doesn't fully accommodate, so interest rates go up, right? Then investment might go down, consumption might go down, reducing the magnitude of the effect of government expenditures on output. Right? The monetary authority can also affect aggregate demand via the nominal interest rate. If investment, maybe even consumption, depend on interest rates, right, then changing the interest rates will change investment and consumption, and hence aggregate demand. All right. Tomorrow, we want to look at moving to the open economy. And tomorrow in the morning, I've put together, so we have just four questions for exercise to review what we did today. And let's see if we've gone everything today. So, this will be interesting. We talked much about this. What happens if we have, at the very end, I talked about the demand, that maybe output is going to go back to some long-run neutral rate of output. Okay? We think about what might happen. Okay. Central banks possibly expect short-term interest rates. Now, what happens if it's only the short-term interest rate, but it's the long-term interest rate that matters for our dividends? All right, and then here, the spending multiplier, goods market, and then financial markets, yeah. And we'll get to those other points. Okay, so I think, we talked about almost all this. I didn't talk as much as I thought, didn't write this down as much on the long run and natural neutral rate. So here we talked about this perhaps in some other math courses earlier, but think about this. And in any case, try and answer some of these questions for tomorrow. And so the whole point is like, I'll go through this with you. You get the most out of this if you try to do this on your own first. I don't need to tell you this. You know this, of course. Your master's students. It's good to hear you. So that's it. We're done for today. Thank you so much for coming. And I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Okay?
Thank you for